that we ask the question, why were the Jews, God's chosen people, in Babylon at all? After all, God had given them the Holy Land, Palestine, as their home, and he had sworn to give them the land and to their seed forever. Why then were they now in Babylon? I ask you to imagine the history of the Jews as a sentence ending in the full stop of Babylon and starting with the experience at Mount Sinai. Because it was there at Mount Sinai that God did a new thing on earth. He took 12 rather ragged Hebrew tribes and he made them his covenant people. And they became his people in a way in which no other nation was his people. And that nation was destined by God to be ruled by God alone. This nation was going to be a theocracy, and God was to be its king. It wasn't to be a monarchy with a human king in charge. It wasn't to be an aristocracy with nobles in charge. It wasn't to be a republic with a president in charge. It was to be a theocracy, and God was to be on the throne of the nation. And for the 600 years, from the time of Moses and Mount Sinai, right down to the full stop of Babylon, the Jews resisted their calling, and they fought against their destiny. They were no sooner away from Sinai than they got tired of Moses. Then they wanted judges, and they got tired of judges. And they got specially tired of the best judge of all, who was Samuel, old Samuel, kindest of all. And then they wanted a king. So they got the kings. Saul, he was a fiasco. David, Solomon. And after the death of Solomon, 10 tribes revolted and left the house of David, the Davidic house, and set up a kingdom of their own. And they vanished when Assyria came down from the north. The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold. His cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. Sennacherib, if you remember the poem. Now that invasion swallowed up those 10 tribes, and they disappeared forever, except that a few survived and became the Samaritans of Christ's day. And that's why the Jews wouldn't speak to the Samaritans, because they regarded them as mongrels. They called them the mingled peoples. But down in the south, 2 tribes, Judah and a part of Benjamin, survived. And there were some godly kings, and the godly kings helped the nation to survive. But bit by bit, and little by little, you see, we don't learn the lessons of history. Who was it who said that the message of history is that we don't learn the message of history? Bit by bit, little by little, Judah in the south went the way of her sister Israel in the north, and down in the south she was swallowed up by Babylon. And so the sentence that started with Sinai ended with the full stop of Babylon. Now, can I change the imagery a little? I've been thinking this week, that was too pessimistic, ending with a full stop. As if God had finished with the Jews, and as if Babylon was the end of the whole escapade. Because, in fact, not only was God on the move inside Babylon, God was on the move after Babylon, because he was now preparing for the coming of his Son, the Christ, into the world. And this time I want you to imagine a line stretching from Adam to Christ. And I want you to see in all that history God contracting and expanding his work. He takes the one, and out of the one he makes many. And once he's got many, out of the many he chooses a one, and out of the one he makes them like lungs, or like the bellows of an organ if they were in working order, wheezing away there with the wind, howling, expanding and contracting. You see it in Adam, where one man becomes a family. The family grows, becomes a nation. The nations develop. Mankind grows. And from Adam's one, there comes mankind's many. And then in the middle of that many, God chooses a man called Noah. Civilization is destroyed by the flood, and you're back to one man again. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and out of Noah and his family, out of the one, God begins to build mankind again. And no sooner has he built mankind, it expanded his work, then he goes back to one again, and out of all the nations, he chooses a Babylonian called Abram, as he was called, 1,600 years or so before Christ. And so he limited himself again, down to one man, and said to that man, in your seed, singular, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And so he begins to build it up again. Isaac, Jacob, 12 sons, 12 tribes, a nation. No sooner is the nation one under David and Solomon that you get the narrowing down again. 10 tribes disappear. 12 suddenly becomes 2. Judah and Benjamin in the south. The 10 in the north disappear forever. But the 2 in the south, the narrowing down of God's work, went into Babylon. That's why the prophet Isaiah, just before the Babylonian captivity, always keeps harping on about the remnant. Isaiah was the prophet of the remnant, the handful, the vestige. Keeps saying, well, there's trouble coming, but a remnant shall return. There is hope for the remnant. That's the message of Isaiah. So the 2 tribes go into Babylon, and some come back, because you see, some of the Jews settled down in Babylon. They built shops, houses, supermarkets, and they settled down in the land and did rather well for themselves. And so you see, only a pathetic handful of Jews came back from Babylon, back to the Holy Land. You can read about this in Ezra and Nehemiah. And from that return, from that remnant, God whittles down his work, until 400 years later, the remnant was as small as an old man and an old woman called Anna and Simeon, who lived in the house of God, longing to see the consolation of Israel, the Christ. Zacharias and Elizabeth, cousins of Mary and Joseph, father and mother of John the Baptist, and Mary and Joseph, until at last God had whittled his work down to one man, the man Christ Jesus. The seed in whom all the nations of the earth were to be blessed. And that's not the end of the story, because out of the seed comes the many. The seed, sown in weakness, the Christ child, the Christ man, sown in weakness, replenishes the earth. That's why you get that wonderful picture in Hebrews of Jesus Christ standing in heaven in the midst of the great congregation, and he says, "Behold, here I am with the children that God has given me. These are my bairns." The seed, sown in weakness, replenishes the earth. Out of the one comes the many, out of the many comes the one, out of the one comes the many, and so on and so on. Like the lungs of God. That's what history is. The lungs of God, contracting and expanding, and always the work going on. Now, I think that picture of expansion and contraction is very true to history, and it's very true to the work of Christ in history. Because sometimes God has to do a small thing in order to do a big thing. He sometimes has to cut down his resources in order to expand. You know, in the Church of Scotland, say this kindly, because I love the Church of Scotland. Why shouldn't I? We're far too taken up with numbers. There are people here who are terrified in case the numbers fall. What does that matter? The Kirk session could put 150 communicant members off our roll tonight. It wouldn't make a vestige of difference to the attendances, and it wouldn't make a vestige of difference to the income. Because they don't come and they don't give. You're far too taken up with numbers and success. You know, it's a stench in the nostrils of God, as if Christ had called us to be successful. Christ has called us to be faithful. That's different. Jesus never guaranteed success to anyone. In the world you shall have tribulation. That's Christ. Sometimes God is to cut down in order to expand his work. And sometimes when he wants his work to expand, he finds one. And out of the one comes the many. Now, I don't know about you, but I found that a great source of encouragement and good cheer. Because it means that no matter how small the work is that I'm doing, it's got a future. I was in Leicester this week, speaking, showing slides of Eastern Europe. The meeting had been intimated for 3 Sundays. How many turned up, think you? 2. Ladies, of course. Too much to expect men to show an interest in the work of Christ abroad. And one of the ladies wasn't even Church of Scotland. She was the wife of the Free Church missionary in Leicester. And Dave Dixon, the minister, is very dejected and downcast. So I had to reassure him, numbers don't matter. Not at all. Not in the slightest. They don't matter at all. If ever I were to come here and find an evening service of 6, after my initial grief, I wouldn't lose heart. 6 with God. It's a very big 6. And if ever I were to come to prayer fellowship on Saturday evening and find, say, just 2 or 3 people there, well, it would sadden me. Because we can't survive without prayer. It would sadden me. But I wouldn't lose heart. God is the God of hope. That's what he's called in the New Testament. He's the God of hope. And sometimes he contracts in order to expand. What has all this to do with Daniel? Where does Daniel stand in all of this? Well, you see, he was living at a time when the work had contracted. He was living in the heart of a nation that was under judgment because the Jews were in Babylon for their sins, not for any other reason. They were there because they had sinned away their day of grace. Now, it's possible to do that as a church as well as individuals. Individual men and women can sit under the sound of the word and sin away the day of grace out of their lives. And churches can do it too. And God sent prophets to bring them back to their senses, but they wouldn't return. And so God brought them to Babylon to burn and to purge the idolatry out of their system. And the Jews have never worshipped idols since Babylon. They've done lots of other things, sinful, wicked things, but they've never bowed down to false gods. And it's the glory of Daniel that in that dark situation, when the work had contracted, that he stood for God. You know, the Victorians were very fond of giving subtitles to their books and novels. I wonder if I've got it right. Eric, or Little by Little. Isn't that how it goes? Eric, or Little by Little. Well, you could give a subtitle to the book of Daniel. The book of the prophet Daniel, or How to be True to God in Adverse Circumstances. Do you want to know how to face adversity and hardship and criticism, especially if you're criticized for your faith? Do you want to know how to maintain your personal integrity in a corrupt world and an idolatrous society that has absolutely no interest whatever in the true and the living God? Do you want to know how to stand for God and be true to Him, whatever it costs you? Then you could do no better thing than read the book of Daniel. And one of the most moving things about Daniel's courage is this: that these boys, Daniel and his three friends, were still teenagers. We think of them as grown men, don't we? But they weren't grown men. The Jewish Apocrypha calls them the Hebrew children. They were in their mid-teens or their late teens. And at that age, of course, young men and young women are under all sorts of pressures, inside them and outside them, to compromise, take the middle road, take the easy way out, go with the crowd. And yet these teenagers stood firm for God in that society. Are you discouraged as a Christian tonight? You have to work with ungodly colleagues. There are no Christians in your office. Well, you take heart from these four teenagers who stood for God in a cruel, cruel, cruel empire. You know that Nebuchadnezzar was famed for his cruelty. You know what he did to the last king of Judah, Zedekiah? He took the old man and brought in all his sons in front of him. And then he butchered all his sons. And then he put out the old man's eyes. The last thing he saw was the massacre of his children, his whole future. No grandchildren for him, no great-grandchildren to dandle on his knee. His whole future was finished. Then his eyes were put out. These teenagers stood up for God. Oh, it's a great story. Turn to 2 Chronicles, will you please? Chapter 36. The closing days. Chapter 36 and verse 11. Zedekiah, 2 Chronicles 36 and 11. Zedekiah, that's the one who saw the sons killed, was 21 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who was preaching in those days, who spoke from the mouth of the Lord. He wasn't going to listen to the minister. He had views of his own. He also rebelled, silly man. It's like a flea rebelling against an elephant to take on the empire of Babylon, now in its second glory. This is the second Babylonian empire. The first one had disintegrated many years before. This was the revival of the empire. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God to be subject. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord, the God of Israel. All the leading priests, church was rotten too, you see, and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. They didn't learn from history. And they polluted the house of the Lord, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, the prophets, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, till the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew the young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. They'd run to the church for sanctuary. Nebuchadnezzar's not interested in that. No such niceties. He had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand. And all the vessels of the house of God, you remember they finish up at Belshazzar's feast. They all get drunk out of the holy vessels. All the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all its precious vessels. That's what Ezra and Nehemiah came home to, a rubbish heap. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths all the days that it lay desolate. It kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Now, can you imagine the impression that all that made on 4 teenagers, sensitive boys, intelligent lads, thinking chaps? They were in Babylon when all that was happening. They came in very early on. And the Hebrews came in waves. There were 3 deportations, you see. 605 BC with the fall of Jerusalem. 597, 10 years later, 587. All their relatives and friends came straggling home. The news came in. The walls were down. The palace was down. The temple was down. The king was gone. His eyes had been gouged out. All the stragglers start. Then the houses, the vessels of the house of God would be paraded through the streets. Can you imagine the impact on 4 teenagers who loved God? And it was in that situation that they stood true to God. What a story. What a story. It's even more subtle, their courage. You see, what's King Nebuchadnezzar up to? Why does he choose the creme de la creme of Jewish boys? Intelligent lads, healthy lads, good-looking lads. Why does he want them? Well, you see, you are witnessing here a process of corruption. These godly boys are going to be made into Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar is breeding a master race in much the same way in which Adolf Hitler tried to breed a master race in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. You remember how he tried to practice eugenics and set up these birth camps and picked out the cream of Germany's youth, blonde fellows, blonde Nordic types, drunk with the philosophy of Nietzsche and his dreams of supermen and a super race, and drunk with the music of Wagner, especially Twilight of the Gods, Götterdämmerung. Nebuchadnezzar was breeding a master race, and he did not want young men with defects or blemishes, just as the Jews were removed by Hitler, and their blemish was that they were Jews. It is his aim to seduce these godly boys from their allegiance to Jehovah. He is going to obliterate their Jewishness, and he's going to turn them into Babylonians by a process of innocent seduction. It changes their food. Nothing wrong with that, of course, until you find out that the food has been in the temple of the idol. And it changes their names. Did you notice that? Daniel means God has judged. Belteshazzar, his new name, means may the God, that's Marduk or Nebo or Bel or some of these other gods, may the God protect his life. May the idol protect his life. Hananiah means Jehovah has been gracious to me, and he becomes Shadrach, which is a twisted name of Marduk, the king of the gods. Azariah means Jehovah has helped me. And he becomes Abednego, the servant of Nebo, or the servant of the Shining One. Now, do you see what's happening? God is being phased out of their lives. They're being brainwashed. They are being given new personalities. I remember reading a very interesting study that was made of some GIs from the American Army who'd been captured in the Korean War and carted up to the north to be brainwashed by the North Korean communists. And the only GIs to survive the brainwashing were those who were either convinced Christians or who had a strong philosophy of life, who had a center to their lives, a backbone that they could hold on to. And at the end of the Korean War, when these chaps were freed, the American psychiatrists tried to undo the brainwashing. And you can guess what happened. They all fell to pieces. They had nervous breakdowns. They were absolutely shattered. That's what's happening in Babylon. New men, new personalities, change their food, change their way of life, change their habit, get the name of God out of their lives. That's what's happening in Babylon, and that is what is happening in our society today. Because since the end of the Second World War, there has been a systematic program of corruption by atheists and humanists. And they use the media, radio, television, theater, cinema. Can I quote some very fine words by Lord Hailsham on this very thing? Listen to these words. Lord Hailsham said, "Our country is being destroyed before our eyes by a conspiracy of intellectuals without faith, delinquents without honor, muckrakers without charity or compassion, young men who are incapable of dreaming dreams, and old men who have never known what it is to see visions. In the public life of today, a public man is mocked when he speaks about patriotism. A cynical sneer greets references to honor and integrity in political as in business affairs. And if someone by chance says that he believes in a healthy family life as the foundation of civilization, or backs the traditional Christian ethic on sex and morals, we hear an awful lot of nonsense about the need for tolerance and charity in allowing the young to be taught to do as they please and allowing them to be kept in ignorance about the inevitable and disastrous consequences of doing so, when the squalid and tragic consequences of their doing so are being played out daily in Parliament and the courts. And picking up that theme, Lord Shawcross, the QC, who was president of the Board of Trade in Attlee's government, speaks about these men who are destroying morals and honor. These miserable little men without a constructive idea, who for money tear down and destroy accepted values and ridicule those who seek to serve their country, you might think that there was nothing worthy in our society. You may be as puzzled as I am about these exhibitionist intellectuals, these psychiatrists in a small way of business, these publicity-seeking clergymen, who talk about the new morality. There is no such thing. The so-called new morality is too often the old immorality condoned. The great principles, this is wonderful. The great principles of good or evil, kindness or cruelty, generosity or selfishness, love or lust, do not change just because some confused bishop writes a book about it. I wish there were time. I would quote from a book called China, Christian Students Face the Revolution, published by the IVP Press. And how these godly young lads, there was a reawakening in China, you see, the end of the war, before the Marxists took over, thriving Christian unions in the Chinese universities. Then the Marxists came in. Old Nebuchadnezzar again, you see. Get rid of the name of God, change their food, change their clothes, change their habits, isolate them, groom them. Can you stand in such a world as a Christian? Yes, you can. There is, of course, only one way, and that's to live a holy life. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. It was as simple as that. He refused the charms, the blandishments, the honors. My friend, I see what Christian consecration is now. It's a series of moral choices. You are in place A rather than in place B, and you are in place A for Christ's sake. You give X pounds to the Lord rather than Y pounds, and you give X pounds for the sake of Christ. It's a series of moral decisions. You see, I think we are still saddled with some of the worst excesses of Victorian evangelicalism, where conversion and consecration were sort of hothouse things, you know, warm feelings and glow and big crowds and special choirs and scattering organs, solos, special appeal, altar calls. Come forward and be converted. Come forward and be consecrated. Sort of hothouse, emotional stuff. Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself with the king's meat. I'm wondering, society being in the state it's in today, I'm wondering whether or not Christians allow themselves too many things nowadays that we would never have allowed, say, 20 years ago. I wonder if Christians are becoming too permissive. too liberal. Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself with the king's meat. I was looking up my old army hymn book, Salvation Army, not the Queen's Army. I didn't get into it. It was grade 4. So it's a miracle I'm here, Mr. Fraser. I had a bad chest in those days, largely because I smoked too much. My old Salvation Army hymn book was the property of George Peary. I think I've told you this. George Peary, my uncle, married to my Auntie Bella. Great drunkard he was. A very wild fellow. Oh, people used to lock the doors when Dodie Peary was on the go. And he got converted at an army meeting. He was speaking to an old lady who remembered the night he got saved. Jumping down from the gallery, the old revival in the 1920s in Salvation Army Hall. And to his dying day, he was called Doddy Brandy, because he always drank brandy. Creme de la creme, you know. Wonderful soul. And they say he just became as gentle as a child once he changed. Wonder, wasn't that kind of soul? And he used to stand in the streets and put soil with his red army jersey on and his army bonnet, singing the songs of Zion. And I notice a very well thumbed page here. Could be Daniel's song. I'd like it to be yours. Am I a soldier of the cross, a follower of the Lamb? And shall I fear to own his cause or blush to speak his name? Must I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fight to win the prize and sail through stormy seas? You see, consecration is a series of moral decisions. When you say no to the challenge, you are responsible for it. Are there no foes for me to face? Must I not stem the flood? Is this vile world a friend to grace, to help me up to God? Since I must fight, if I would reign, increase my courage, Lord. That's what Christians need today. Solzhenitsyn saying this all over America, that the thing that Christians need today is courage. Since I must fight, if I would reign, increase my courage, Lord. I'll bear the toil, endure the pain, supported by thy word. Amen. May God make us worthy and bless his word to us all.